So without further ado, I'd like to start the Circular Ideas session that Laetitia introduced, where we've got some amazing MA students from across UAL, and they'll be presenting their ideas. First of all, I would like to introduce Daniella Jenkins, who is our facilitator and moderator for this session. Daniella is currently a PhD researcher at UAL, which is funded as part of the studentship between UAL and King's College London. She previously led initiatives in health policy at the Cabinet Office and at Transport for London, and is committed to gender equality, which we love. Having managed the WOW Foundation as its first executive director, she's now serving on steering committees for the Women's Equality Party and a pensions advisor to the Women's Budget Group. So we're really pleased to have her here. So you'll be hosting the session with our MA students, and we have Kayla Katz, Cathy Quinn, Holly English, Claudia Sambo, and Rebecca Gim. Without further ado, I would like to play each student's video. It will have 10 minutes of Q&A with Daniella before we move on to the next one.
Hi, my name is Cathy Quinn. I've just begun my final year on the MA Biodesign at Central St Martin's. I'm excited to share with you my work in progress. When you hear of squid and mushrooms, you probably think of food. By the end of this presentation, I hope to challenge your preconceptions of the humble mushroom and mystical squid, and how they can be important components for circular economies in the context of the fashion industry. I began conceptualization of this research during my last project. I was exploring creating new circular materials deriving from natural sources, experimenting with ways to create textiles from them. The more I read around the necessity for these materials, I began to feel as though I was skipping past a step. 300,000 tons of used clothing goes to landfill that could be transformed into recycled fabrics. I realised that I wanted to focus on addressing how we can transform textile waste into a valuable material. I seek to explore ways to combine waste fibres with biological sources to create new textiles. Textile recycling is not a new thing, but they present their challenges. Although chemical recycling can retain the strength of the initial virgin fibres, the use of toxic chemicals makes it problematic for the environment, as well as requiring expert knowledge and expensive processing. Mechanical recycling is the more popular method of textile recycling, but it also has its limitations. The fibres lose integrity and produce shorter lengths, which need to be combined with virgin components. This process is also not suitable for every fabric type due to the loss of integrity, as well as a lot of micro-shedding happening in the process. This is where the focus of my research began to narrow in on the ways in which biological sources can be used on recycled fibres to improve mechanical strength. Can squid be a catalyst in improvements for textile recycling? I first became fascinated with squid many years ago whilst watching deep-sea documentaries and first saw a giant squid cutting through the water. I was intrigued after reading stories of how under-researched they were and still are. There are over 350 types of squid. They have adapted to live in the cold depths of the ocean as well as warm shallows. They have evolved to develop adaptations that scientists are still attempting to understand. They are known for their ability to change shape, size, and colour, as well as having some of the most incredible survival strategies. There are several features that they have evolved to become fierce predators, including communication through flashing their skin and the release of ink to confuse and distract predators. The parts of squid that my current research has now focused in on are the gladius or pen, which is a rigid internal structure that runs through the upper part of the squid, and the squid ring teeth. The gladius is composed of a material called chitin. It is the second most abundant polymer after cellulose, but yet rarely seen applied in the fashion industry. It provides some interesting properties such as biodegradability, biocompatibility, and lack of toxicity. I have already begun testing outputs of this material to create sequins. More experimentation will be conducted to produce materials for 3D printer filament as well as fibres. What really captured my amazement were the squid ring teeth. Here's an image I captured of the tentacles of the squid. Tentacles allow agile movement as well as used in defense. On the tentacles there are suction cups which provide stronger grip. Within these suction cups, as can be seen in this picture, there are small serrated black teeth. These are the squid ring teeth. These teeth are made up of proteins that provide incredibly diverse properties that include biocompatibility, biodegradability, and most interestingly, healing or bonding qualities. Testing conducted by bioengineers at Penn State shows that bonding qualities of this protein on fibers have shown great promise. Through gentle heat and pressure, bonding of fibers occur. The protein can be extracted from the native squid ring teeth, which I've begun collecting, as well as through synthesizing through DNA sequencing, which I hope to do in collaboration with a lab here in London. My research seeks to experiment with the application of chitin and squid ring teeth proteins on recycled fibers to produce a circular biocoating to investigate if they improve mechanical strength and in turn improving methods of textile recycling, restrict microfibers from being released, and reduce the use of toxic chemicals, both of which seriously harm biodiversity. In my work, systems thinking models are important when researching and developing new materials and understanding their potential negative impact at each stage of a product's life cycle. It is vital for any designer such as myself to think about circularity and push towards regenerative designs so we can transform waste from one industry to useful materials in another. Questions that are pertinent in my mind are: what happens to this material at the end of use? How can my work support a circular economy? And can my work become regenerative? Fungi are nature's recycler, decomposing matter. Mycelium is the vegetative tissue of the fungus, the medium through which it absorbs nutrients. This research was conducted through a group project last year. We used a range of waste collected from CSM, with the main body of that waste consisting of textiles. Mycelium was then grown on this waste to produce the shape of a mould which we designed. Here are some of the benefits of mycelium-based products. Could this be the shift towards how we deal with our textile waste? Could this provide cost-effective insulation for affordable housing? This flowchart represents my hypothesis and how I plan to connect the dots of each component of my research. Textiles are recycled and coated with biomaterial to improve strength. Products are produced with new composite material. At the end of use, the textile is placed in a mould and decomposed by mycelium. A new mycelium material produced can be used in another industry. When this material reaches its end of life, it decomposes. This model represents my proposed body of research. There is a key aspect that enables it to be executed, which is the new consumption model. It is important that although my research seeks to improve methods of recycling, I do not want to encourage an attitude of overconsumption. We have to shift away from a mindset without consideration of the impact our behaviour has on other people through bad working conditions and our natural environment through loss of biodiversity. My new consumption model seeks to highlight the need to celebrate craftsmanship and creativity through the longevity of our clothes. Thank you. If you would like to follow the progress of my project, please follow me on Instagram at c.qstudio. Thank you for listening.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Can I invite Daniella and Kathy to come on to the screen?
Hello. Hi, can you see me?
You can.
Can you see me? Brilliant. Okay? I can see you perfectly, Cassie. Thank you so much for that presentation, which I think was so informative and insightful. But I suspect that I'm not the first person to ask you, what drew you to squid?
So I conducted a lot of research, and I mean, squid had been a subject I'd been fascinated by for years and years, and it had always been so elusive of a creature. And when I started actually investigating into a lot of their qualities, I was amazed at how there could be so much application if there was just like that bit more research, and especially within the fashion industry. So I think it was just something that was always kind of niggling in my mind, and I thought this MA would be the perfect chance to be able to actually explore it further.
And what I find really interesting is that you've taken two aspects which are quite visceral. You know, squid, people think of as kind of, you know, these sea creatures. There are all these sort of mythologies around, you know, giant squid taking down seamen. And then you've got fungus as well, you know, this thing that we almost want to get rid of. And that you've taken both of these aspects, which perhaps we're repelled by, and then employed it in a way that really brings them into use, into utility. Was that part of your motivation?
Yes, definitely. I think that there, especially like the word sustainability in fashion, a lot of people who aren't interested in that subject have this sort of preconceptions of what that means. And I think I really wanted to bring these materials that are kind of, yeah, like you say, you immediately kind of think ick at them, and then transform them into these luxurious products, and you kind of change those preconceptions of what they could be and what their applications could be.
Brilliant. And again, one of the things that I picked up in your presentation was that you talked about taking a systems approach. Could you talk about that a bit more? Because I mean, one of the things that struck me was that you wouldn't want to get into a situation where people were squid farming in a way.
Yeah.
So I mean, what did that analysis throw up for you?
So, well, actually, this is the really interesting thing about that research is although they discovered this protein through the actual squid ring teeth, there's a method of being able to synthesize the protein from DNA sequencing. So that would happen in a lab, which means that you wouldn't need any squid to be harmed in the process of creating that. So that means that, you know, there is a way that you could reproduce it on a sort of industrial scale without harming any of the animals. But in terms of like the systems thinking, that's the reason why I then brought the research that I had conducted in mycelium, because when I started experimenting with these materials, as well as the ones I have before, I started to realize, although it says they're biodegradable, although they're biocompatible, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just throw them on the ground and it's fine. There needs to be, I need to have considered the process of when this is done, when this is, you know, no longer of use, what will then happen to this material or this product. And that's why I really want to connect that dot, so you have that sort of circular image, that circular model in place from the point of design. And I think it's really interesting because what I've started to really love doing is when I start a project is thinking about that last point as well. And I think designers have this really beautiful opportunity with all these innovations around research, that you can actually make design about the last part, you know, make designing that end of life, that end of system.
Right. And you spoke quite passionately about not wanting to encourage overconsumption. Is that something that generally informs your work?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very interested about behavioral science and just the consumption that the situation that we're in at the moment. And I'm very careful to not try and blame one sort of, you know, demographic for the, you know, overconsumption, like people like in fast fashion. I don't think that's the issue. I think it's, you know, we should celebrate that people like style, people like fashion trends, and that's fine. We just need to find that balance, and it's about education, having the right products out there, letting people know that something happens at the end of your garment's life. You know, when you put it in the bin or recycling, it's just not necessarily just going to be figured out by itself. So I think it's important to have that aspect of my work.
Brilliant. Well, we've got some questions that have come through. I know we've got a question or a comment from Becky Early, Professor Becky Early. Can I bring Becky online, or is that something that Cathryn can do? I'm sorry, this is me and the technology. Let's see.
I think I should have done it. Brilliant. Does that work?
Yes.
Hi. Hello, everyone. So great to see you all and all of the audience. And it's wonderful. And thank you, Laetitia, Cathryn, for organising this third amazing TABRA event. And thank you so much, Cassie, for your presentation. There's so much in it that I wanted to talk to you about. But just one question, I think. I'm going to try and boil it down. So I think circular economies and designing for circular economies, plural, is very much about finding the waste streams that are out there and working out how we all sort of loop, how we can build this whole industrial symbiosis sort of landscape in the future. So it's such a fascinating space to be researching. I'm going to ask you just one question. I want to say thank you, first of all, for educating me on how to pronounce what I've always called Kaito, thank you. And to say there must be some studies out there about how Kaito-san, the material, is being recycled. So it'd be great to look at that from textile recycling perspective. But I was really intrigued that you're taking on a really big challenge of making sort of long life, durable product from something that actually composes almost overnight in the fridge, a mushroom. How are you going to get durability out of something so sort of molecularly unstable?
Yeah, so the method of growing those materials is, once you get the mycelium to fully form, so it's like a white form that you kind of see in that picture, and you get that to fully form, then you bake it, and within that is seals that product. Of course, it doesn't last as long as, say, a regular brickwood or foam insulation, but I think that the way that the application for that could be, we consider that. And I'm not considering this material to be replacing building materials as to build a house in the current day, but I think that there's definitely applications for that material that would need something that's quite quick in the turnover. I mean, we made those tiles last year and they're still completely fine. They haven't started to decompose at all because they're not in that environment. Once you place it in the soil, in the ground, with the right nutrients that start breaking that down, that's when that process would really speed up and then start to begin. But outside of that, it's fine.
Great. So it hasn't changed at molecular level to the point where it can't break down organically when you compost it.
Yeah.
Superb. Thank you.
No worries, thank you.
Brilliant. Well, we've had a few questions through. One of the questions about scalability. I mean, do you see this as a process which could be employed globally, for example?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, like I was saying before about the DNA sequencing, this could happen. This could be reproduced at a lab scale. Obviously, that's just for testing. But in terms of actually reproducing the chemical, within the paper that I was reading, they were able to reproduce it in big drums and to actually scale it up, and it gets in a lot lower in cost as well. So I definitely think it could be a lot bigger and global. But I think, especially in terms of different parts of the world, it depends on the waste streams that are particularly coming from there. I think wherever the main application would work best is where that would probably be best to scale.
Right, that makes sense. So rather than importing squid into an area that maybe it's not, it wouldn't have squid otherwise, that you would utilize it where they would be otherwise. So quite a few questions actually about the squids particularly. So we've obviously excited people with the idea of squid. I mean, you did say no squid are harmed during this process. I mean, would you consider it to be a vegan or vegetarian process, therefore?
If it was the DNA synthesized version, definitely, yeah. Because the way that they've done that, it's looking at the sequence of DNA proteins, and that's like through a microscope and reproducing that. So that is absolutely nothing, no animal is used in that. In the versions that I've been experimenting with, because I haven't had access to the right equipment and the right lab to do that replication, it is using an actual squid, the actual native ring teeth protein. But there's both ways. There's ways that this can be developed so that it's completely vegan. It's completely, no harm to any squid.
And does that throw up a kind of ethical tension? Because I noticed that you described it as sort of collaboration. So we're collaborating with biology. Do you think that that is a shift from sort of utilizing nature to working in conjunction with? And is that one of the aims of the sorts of processes that you're looking at, is that it becomes a co-creation rather than a use of biology?
Definitely, yeah. I think when anything's new, you have to look at the native source, and that's how we study things. That's how we've always studied things in biology, especially. And I think it's to ensure that there's the knowledge that this isn't going to be reproduced at a scale where we're farming squid and we're using that native part, because that would even be, convenient anyway to do that. But I think at this point in time, at this point of research, you need to have that tangibility to look at the qualities of the squid. If you compare it to the mussel glue that was researched about 15 years ago, they were studying the mussels and reproducing that glue, but then they actually figured out they can make it stronger because that organism only needed to make it just as strong. And maybe that is what we could find out from the squid, that they're only making the strength of their ring teeth so strong because that's all they need to for the predators that they would attack, whereas we could actually probably increase that strength using biology and using biosynthetic.
Brilliant. So it took me 1 second there to realise you were talking about mussels, the shellfish. But we've also had questions through around the demand side of this. So somebody's asked about whether you've considered different consumption models. And similarly, somebody else has asked that they've kind of gone back to this kind of visceral nature that would people be put off just thinking of squid? They maybe it puts them off thinking about using them in this way.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I've considered, and that's definitely where the behavioral science part of things comes in, because I'm very interested in marketing, and there's a lot of things that were once not very sought after, and just by changing the way that you market it, the way that you tell that story, I think that really changes it. I'm going to be very careful whenever I have completed this project and I'm exhibiting it to use my words wisely, because I think that it's definitely important to highlight the squid, but to also take that consideration, like you say, that people might be turned off. But I think it's just that's where the behavioral science and looking at the different terminology, the words that we can use to educate but not turn people off.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cassie. We've got to move on because we've got another presentation to go through. But thank you so much for sharing your work, and to everyone for sharing your questions. I know that Cassie will have the opportunity to review those later. So thank you so much for sharing your work.
Thank you so much.
No, brilliant. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to share the next presentation for you all to watch.
If you don't like capitalism, mate, what's the alternative?
Money. Have you thought about what your money is? Could it be a potato instead? Sure, it's a little bulky, but actually it's a really beneficial attribute. Yes, I'm going to tell you how. But first, how does using a potato instead of a dollar or a yen contribute to circular economies? Well, design interventions need to be supported by a favorable system. A potato currency would function as a systemic enabler of circular economies by diminishing our capitalist inclinations.
I think we're like dreaming this big crazy thing where it is the currency of the world.
It would underpin a system that incentivizes circular thinking. In addition to a new financial system, the potato currency would bring tangible benefits such as decreasing pollution, prioritizing green space, increasing composting, and local trading. They are very inclusive. They can be grown virtually anywhere in a wide range of climates and substrates. They are zero waste and don't tarnish easily. Physically, they could easily be circulated as a unit of exchange, and of course, they could be eaten too. Potatoes are quite amazing when you think about it. They are very nutritious and they're low fat too. Did you know that a human could live for 2 to 3 months entirely on a mono diet of potatoes? And they have huge cultural importance. If it wasn't for potatoes, the West would not be the global superpower it is today. It was this reliable food source that allowed the population to expand rapidly. Such powerful little tubers. Could potato currency be their new achievement? First, we need to look at what a currency entails.
Historically, people have thought about money having 3 functions. It's a unit of exchange, it's a unit of account, and to store of value. And gold nicely ticks all those boxes.
Ideally, it's durable, portable, divisible, uniform, limited in supply, and widely accepted.
Everyone has to agree it's acceptable.
So could potatoes really function as a currency? Theoretically, yes. In theory, there is no reason why it could not be a unit for measure of value. Some of these functions are somewhat arbitrary. The potato's value as a currency would be directly related to its nutritional value. It would be cumbersome, but yes, it could be exchanged too. Although it wouldn't store indefinitely, it's quite hardy and can be replanted and multiplied as a form of storage. Its limited durability is a positive, because it inhibits wealth accumulation and encourages a healthier relationship with money. It's also not of limited supply, but neither are currencies these days. Money is being printed in vast quantities if needed, and this is happening now. Acceptability is the real crux of this.
Everyone has to agree it's acceptable.
It would imply that our belief systems had shifted to prioritize the planet over profit. But the coming upheavals in global financial systems might be in our favor. You may have noticed that we have made one big assumption, that the potato's monetary value can't be related to nutrition. Someone could invent a machine that quickly determines the nutritional value of a potato, something along the lines of a potato BMI calculator, but more sophisticated. But if this is possible, then there will be a constant value operating similarly to a gold standard. And if this is the case, then the potato is also a really safe asset because it can always be eaten. And this value never changes. There would be no fluctuation. A bad potato year would not mean that your potatoes were worth more than in a better year, and we can always grow more potatoes. Theoretically, the more work you put in, the more money you will have. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's a no-brainer, really. Potato currency is circular by nature. It creates a system which favors the environment, sustainability, and equality. The need to maximize nutritional content is linked to many environmental benefits. Take crop rotation, for example. It would be necessary to minimize plant disease, but would also incentivize green space. Every field of money would need 3 fields to be fallow, or growing other crops to fix nitrogen in the soil and feed pollinators. Domestic crops would mean more home composting and increased generation of soil that is rich in nutrients. But think, potato currency cannot be hoarded. At some point, it needs to be eaten, spent, replanted, composted, or put to a different use. This relationship creates a much healthier idea of wealth, away from accumulation and towards year-to-year replenishment. And here's why bulkiness is good. Okay, a little bit more trouble than a credit card, but this in practicality would encourage localization and swapping. If you think this sounds crazy, well, think again. This is the perfect moment for a potato currency. We're hurtling towards a post-COVID economic collapse. It's going to be far worse than after the 2008 global financial crisis. Money is being printed in unprecedented amounts. How long can this go on? We know that economies will have to restructure. We just don't know how yet. But if you look, there is a delicious solution staring us in the face. Potato currency. Of course, for potato currency to really shape a more equal society, it would have to go hand in hand with some type of land reform, already a very tricky issue. Then there is the worry about deforestation and how would international trade operate. Right now, we don't have all the answers, but we may have found someone who does.
How post-capitalist society might function? Work, land use, international trade, international payments. How would all that work?
It takes some creativity, but there are solutions out there if only you look for them. There's a lot we still don't know, but the potato currency seems feasible. The post-COVID world is going to be a very different place. Our current systems will be unrecognizable, and we will need radical new ideas. Potato currency requires a huge shift in the popular mindset. away from capitalism and more focus on the common good. Things are already changing, and a nudge with a potato could be exactly what we need.
Thank you so much. Can I invite Holly English and Claudia Sambo to come on screen?
Hi.
Brilliant. Hi, Holly. Hi, Claudia. I mean, that was an amazing presentation. We've had a few questions coming through about potato allergies, but before we get to that, I'm just fascinated. I mean, what does the potato represent to you? A question that I never thought I would ask.
I suppose it's kind of underrated, isn't it? It kind of everybody, well, not everyone, some people have allergies, but most people eat potatoes and they're affordable and they've got this huge history. They're kind of accessible, aren't they? I suppose they represent equality in some way, that most people have access to them.
And Claudia, I mean, you both sort of alluded to the cultural significance of potatoes. You think of things like the potato famine, for example, you know, vodka made from potatoes. I mean, was that part of your use of this particular vegetable to sort of represent value?
It's during the research, it was obvious, you know, how huge potatoes are and how we don't really realize they have this really long history. I mean, they came with gold from the Americas. They turned to gold. But still, it's very humble. It's something, it comes from the earth and something that we eat, and normally we don't give it a second thought. So being artists, we looked at, there are so many implications coming out of this research. So there are so many strands, and initially we were just trying to look about the currency, really. Obviously, on the cultural side, we are also very aware this is a very Western thing. We are aware of that. So we just wanted to make sure that, yes, we are aware potatoes. However, it's kind of interesting that the Chinese government is trying to promote potatoes, because then the land would benefit from all this rotation. It requires less water than rice. Whether the Chinese population will embrace potatoes is another thing. But the moment you start studying this potato, you just don't think about it, you eat it. There are actually so many broad-ranging themes and implications. It's fascinating. And I mean, I'm an artist. I never really thought about this before, and it's opened up all these social and economic questions.
And I think that's what I found so fascinating about your work. And in some ways, it does build on that there is a field of economic anthropology, which looks at different forms of values and how value is sort of embodied within objects. I mean, what I found quite interesting was that you did settle on a currency that was quite tangible. So at the point where we're moving increasingly towards intangible currency, you're looking at something that is quite tangible. Was that quite important when you thought about democratizing value and democratizing currency in this way? Should I put that?
Sorry, could you just summarize? I was reading a question, and could you just summarize?
Sorry, I know it's a schoolgirl error. I know you've got this thing going on at the side of you. So I'm interested in the fact that the potato is so tangible. You know, it's real.
Yes.
You know, Claudia's holding a potato right now, and increasingly we've got credit cards, we've got Apple Pay, we've got Bitcoin. We move towards intangible currency, and I was just interested in perhaps your motivation for thinking of this very tangible, biodegradable object as currency.
Yeah, well, I think by sort of touching it all the time, you're more aware of the meaning of money and what you use it for, and also what we said about kind of local trading, that it kind of encourages you to sort of closer to swapping, I suppose, with your, like, in your local community. It could be used much more broadly, but it encourages all these positive kind of green benefits by being bulky.
Yeah, I can see questions there, and but actually, I think, yeah, also about value. It's trying to think differently about how we value things, and but also from financial, where is the value coming from our currency, and can that be changed? So that's why we settled on the nutritional value, that is a real value, while what we have in the pound is something completely arbitrary. It's predetermined. It's not even linked to gold anymore. And even gold, if you think about it, gold has no use whatsoever. I mean, it's only valuable because there isn't very much of it, so it's so precious. So it's just a way of changing completely our mindset and imagining a world where we have a different way of thinking about our relationship between ourselves and with the earth.
Yeah, and I got that, and I think, because I think it's quite easy to kind of focus on the potato and the feasibility of the potato. But what I really loved about your work was that the potato becomes a vehicle by which we question all of these assumptions about where money comes from, about where value comes from, about how we democratize that. And I know we don't have much time to go through it, and I'm sure that your presentation will absolutely get people thinking. And so I just wanted to thank you for that. There's lots of questions coming through, but I particularly wanted to thank you for taking something that's so accepted and then placing that within a new kind of paradigm through something almost not as trivial, but something so ubiquitous as the potato. So thank you for that. I never thought that I would have this conversation. So thank you for just demonstrating how far we can stretch that.
Thank you, because also as artists, I mean, it's wonderful to be able to present this piece to not in a gallery, but to a group, of thinkers outside just the art world.
So we've got a question, I think, from Emmeline.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting and really got me to think really about the system. But I was interested to understand what you felt or how we could make this work in an increasingly global society. So there's a lot of positives we have for being globalized, and I don't see it wanting to shift completely to localized. How do we kind of embody the two?
Yeah, we're really early in this research, as you might be able to tell. So like global trading is something that we want to look at more. But I think it could be. I was kind of looking very quickly at the science, and it's becoming more and more possible to grow them in like a hot climate. So it could, it would be possible for it to be a worldwide thing. But yeah, we don't know very much yet about how it would work internationally, to be honest.
And that's what we didn't have time in the short presentation to discuss all the problems we encountered. And we had this little clip from Yanis Varoufakis, was not intended to promote his book, but just as the book came out, and actually he had some solution to exactly these questions. How would it work internationally? So how would the system could work? So there could be a separate digital system for international trade, while locally you have a separate form of currency. The other big problem was land distribution, because of course, the moment you think of land, you go, the problems that come out with land are huge. And of course, he has this, it's a visionary proposal of land distribution regionally. So we thought, well, at this stage, that's all we know. We kind of accept that, we cannot solve all the problems. But,
yeah, I think we kind of,
you can find some solution.
yeah, we're kind of imagining this like in a different time. It would be a time where people would have already accepted or have kind of similar values that made this able to operate. But yeah, that would have to come with land reform. And I think in that book he was kind of talking about land going back to be owned by the public, and then that being kind of leased back. Yeah, there's lots of kind of theories that we don't know very much about yet, but I'm sure we can find them the longer we spend on it.
Thank you both so much. One, thank you, Emmeline, for a really great question. Thank you both. I know we could probably talk about potato currency all day, partly because you provoke thought around a lot of assumptions that we make, and it challenges our institutions. So thank you so much. Congratulations to Peter. I do demand that you share a photo of your potato tattoo that he's going to get in inspiration from your presentation today. Thank you again for sharing your work. I know it's at an early stage, but thank you so much for sharing. And I know we're going to move on now to the next presentation, but thank you so much. And thank you for
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move on to our next presentation.
My name is Brooke Kim, and my project is called De-Waste Your Taste. Did you know 1/3 of the food produced in the world for human consumption every year is wasted? That's $1 trillion every year. That's a loss of revenue that could be spent for things like healthcare, public transport, education, etc. 925 million out of 7 billion are starving, yet we annually waste 1.3 billion tons of food, enough to feed 3 billion people. To put that into perspective, if food waste were its own country, it would be the world's 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter. Food loss in the field are resources like water, land, energy, labor, and capital, which needlessly produce greenhouse gas emissions. Food loss during harvest and in storage translates into lost income for farmers and into higher prices for consumers. In medium or high income countries, food is lost at later stages in the supply chain, meaning consumers play a huge part in industrialized countries. Food is a tricky subject when it comes to circular economy because they're all perishable to a certain point, so it's inherently linear. However, prolonging its life with preservation will minimize waste to begin with. Also, there are more than compost or animal feedstock that can close the loop, such as brewing beer with leftover bread, using coffee grinds as body scrubs, and more. However, there's still not a lot of awareness or urgency when it comes to food waste. That's because food system is driven by food choice, by the consumer, which is influenced by ideals, personal needs and preferences, social framework, and physical and cultural context. It's all governed by what we're comfortable with, what our dietary or religious restrictions are, how we've been educated around healthy food, etc. Our addiction to convenience, such as non-seasonal food, ready all year round, or the rise in demand for non-local food, creating environmental and social impact. For example, the trend for avocado has started a gang war in Mexico. The thirst for chocolate has depleted Ivory Coast of its protected land to grow cacao, so I started to investigate what guards our minds on what's edible and what's preferable. As someone who grew up in between cultures, I was familiar with different behaviors and different culture around food. I was born and raised in Gwangju, South Korea, where our food is famous even amongst Koreans. On the left side of my hometown, we have the ocean, and on the right side, we have rice fields. Our region was the optimal area that had access to all the different resources our land could offer. But I spent most of my adult life in California, and now London. I've always been a food lover, so I was able to experience not only the beauty of diverse food culture, but also the discrimination that follows the unfamiliar. But I couldn't really pinpoint my experience with food bias as such until I saw this tweet. This is kebul, which is a Korean delicacy. J.K. Rowling says I won't be ordering this in a restaurant, truly revolting, and deemed this dish inedible or unpreferable because of how it looks in its raw form, just as foie gras would be. But her personal food choices and experiences in the past deemed foie gras to be a luxury, whereas kebul not. I felt the shame around how my food looks or smells my whole life, but I never really pinpointed this as xenophobia. Which made me wonder, what bias does a Western food media and culinary world have towards not just Eastern food, but towards all non-European food? The more I researched, I saw the connections of history, and it's one dominant narrative told by the winners of colonialism, and the current capitalist system we live in doesn't leave room for minorities' voices or cultures to be legitimized, but more fetishized and exploited. I've been focusing on the environmental impact of our current industrialized food system, but I realized that the social aspect is just as important as reversing industrial agriculture to bring sustainability in a respectful and ethical way. To solidify my assumption about food bias towards Eastern food, I decided to do some more data collection by conducting implicit association test, or IAT, which is a tool commonly used to measure bias by calculating the accuracy and response time of a test. It was first developed in the 90s by Harvard to measure racist bias, but over the years it's been applied to various biases. I built mine to be Eastern food versus Western food, and surprisingly there were more bias towards Western food than Eastern food. The feedback showed that people associated Western food with junk food, or they knew about the food apartheid. And during an interview with Christian Reynolds, a food policy expert, he urged me to consider neophobia, fear of new things, and neophilia, love of new things, that individuals carry to different degrees, because these biases can't be simplified into just cultural or racial. How do I dismantle neophobia and cultural or racial bias through food? I wanted to demystify and destigmatize Eastern food, and I started by collecting knowledge and insights that honors all parts of the food from my hometown and my family to share through a platform. I knew since I was young that Korean cuisine held immense knowledge and insights that were sustainable in regards to low electricity, low waste, and even supports regenerative agriculture by returning rice or sesame seed husks to the soil and using ducks to get rid of leeches instead of chemicals. I interviewed my mom, grandma, cousin's grandma, local street vendors, vegan chefs, and even Buddhist monks. Their view and value of food was quite extraordinary. They've described our body to be a form of fermentation as well, referring to the extensive tradition around fermentation in Korean cuisine. It was important for me to bring that credit and light back onto the people that I interviewed and interacted with through my design solution. Whilst I was interviewing these incredible Korean cooks, I was also connecting with food experts and chefs and home cooks who wanted to learn about Korean cuisine. I started to form a community which began with cooking sessions. I named my project De-Waste Your Taste to highlight minimizing food waste by changing the way you view what's tasty. I believe bringing circularity to food in terms of upcycling used ingredients is a key component to my project, but the way to do that is to open the minds and palates of the consumers. I continued doing these sessions, but I decided to call them open fridge sessions because it was more than a cooking session. It provides information about the origins and the history of the dish and its diversity as well. It's also about learning how to utilize everything in your fridge and then try experimenting with them. I am planning on bringing on farmers, foragers, and other variety of food lovers as hosts for open fridge sessions, which you are all welcome to join. I am now at the stage of creating a website that will hold a participatory digital cookbook. It will be mirroring where the DYT community is coming from and what their sustainable eating focus is. There will be chapters and downloadable templates for the cookbook and even a map that shows the location of specific cultural grocery near your location. I hope to democratize this knowledge instead of making it a fancy branding project that dismisses the collective rituals and sharing culture that the food was born out of. I think this platform can bring circular consumption of food to be easier to follow and even fun when we do it together. Because it only takes a slight change of perspective to view something as wasteful or not. When you're finished with your tea, infuse your leftover tea leaves as a toner. When you have onion skin left over, grind it up and put it into your bread. There will be so many fascinating upcycling tips and tricks for you all. If you'd like to be updated about the upcoming website, please follow De-Waste Your Taste on Instagram. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. I'd like to welcome Rebecca Gim.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Gim.
Thank you so much for.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for such a fantastic presentation. I'm going to see whether I can get Daniella back on the mic. Are you there, Daniella?
I am. You should hopefully be able to hear me.
We can.
Brilliant. Sorry about that. Brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca, so much. I really loved your presentation, and I don't know whether it's good, but I really felt the connection between culture and food and value, actually. So sort of echoing some of the themes from our last presentation. I mean, do you think there is a cultural dimension to the relationship between culture and food waste? And I'd be quite interested in just hearing some of your reflections from the sort of different areas that you have resided in.
Yeah, I think there's definitely economical levels and financial levels that come into the whole cultural conversation, because Korea has went through IMF, which is a time where it was a national crisis and we didn't have a lot of money. And during that time, I think poverty and the lack of food kind of pushed us to go out into the fields and discover all these new techniques and insights to feed ourselves. And that exists all over the world. And I think I'm also limited in the way that I only know Korean cuisine, and those are I'm limited towards, and that's why I wanted to open up the conversation towards Mexican Americans who have been working towards food sovereignty for years, or Native Canadians, and there are so many more communities who have so much more insights. And for your question about where I have been residing in, I definitely see such difference in terms of how people approach food. And how much time they put into food, or how much they are easily just throwing things away, or they wanted to keep it, using it as leftovers. And there are a lot of differences, I would say, especially for LA. This just might be something a bias that I have, but I did see a lot of food waste in LA particularly. I think it's just because people are not as used to growing food, and they don't have a connection with soil and food and nature in general. So it was just, I think that's also a part of it. But in London, it's quite different. There's a lot more greenery, and people love to go to farmers markets, and it's I think there's more of a connection. But it's a different level to what I see in Korea, and there's different interests. Like dairy isn't as much of an industry in Korea, so I think it all varies in different layers. If that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. And it might reflect my own kind of bias. But one of the things that I picked up was that as you were sort of researching both the food, and I love that idea that creativity has kind of come through necessity within your own sort of South Korean culture, that you referred back sort of intergenerationally through your own family. I mean, is that a learning journey that you think around those kind of attitudes towards food and value and what waste is? Do you think that is something that comes through generationally?
That's actually a great question, because our generation, the community of food researchers that I've met in South Korea also have the same question in mind, because our country has been accelerating for so long, when we've been focused on GDP and economic growth for so long, that the intergenerational gap is actually huge, and not just in the insight about food, but in terms of how open we are in accepting different ideas in politics. And there's actually a huge gap. So my parents' generation are actually the first generation that's actually losing the knowledge around food. So my mom's, I think, quite unique in the sense that we're still making kimchi at home, but that culture is actually getting lost. Nobody's making kimchi at home anymore. They're buying them. And my grandmother, my mom's mother, she used to make rice cakes, but my mom doesn't do that anymore. So there are little bits of recipes and knowledge that's getting lost in between. And the researchers that I've met were actually struggling to find, keep looking for those recipes and insights and hold on to them before our grandmother's generation isn't here anymore. So that's one of the missions that we have for sure.
I'm so fascinated by your work, and apologies because we've probably run through a bit too much time before, so we don't have a huge amount of time to answer questions. I know there are a lot of questions coming through, particularly around things like how your approach might be used within a more commercial setting rather than domestic setting. So perhaps that's something we could sort of pick up either sort of later through other discussions or perhaps offline. But I did want to thank you very personally, because I could really see that you were sharing from a really personal perspective, but looking at how that could be that sort of response and talking about shame, but how that could turned around to become a learning point for everyone. So thank you so much, because I think that in itself, that process of turning things around into something that could be really productive and positive, I think is a great learning point in terms of this particular subject area. So thank you so much for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Rebecca, you've got some amazing comments in the chat bar, so do go and have a look at those in a minute. We're going to move on to our next video, and just bear with me while I bring this up.
My name is Kayla Katz, and my project is the Fiber Lab Collective. This research asks, what can we do about increasing waste streams when 55% of the world's population currently resides in condensed urban areas? This question will be explored alongside a personal dilemma that came from being a conscious designer and wondering if fashion could ever be truly sustainable. My journey into the industry started in 2016 when I completed my BFA in fashion design and later moved to New York City, where I worked as a freelance designer and stylist. I later went on to work for a large, fast fashion brand where I saw firsthand the unsustainable realities of the global fashion industry. This is where I knew I wanted to be part of the solution instead of continuing to contribute to the problem. Which has brought me to where I am today, completing my final year on the MA Fashion Futures course at London College of Fashion. My Fiber Lab research is focused on developing resilience and regeneration within urban hyperlocalized settings, and exploring the materials and systems needed to create an urban fiber shed. This research will take place within the borough of Waltham Forest, London. The fiber shed is a regenerative fashion system that takes place in a rural setting and encompasses the entire fashion supply chain, from raw materials to garments, all within a 150-mile radius. The system utilizes material sources that are native to the rural landscape, such as wool, cotton, and bast fiber. However, these processes are distinctly suitable for those of a specific rural demographic with access to and ownership of land. My research asks, how can urban landscapes with limited space and expensive real estate develop their own regional textile or fashion supply chains? And what materials could be used to fuel the development of regenerative fashion systems within an urban setting? In order to answer these research questions, I've decided to focus primarily on the borough of Waltham Forest, London. This borough has a robust industry of fashion manufacturers, designers, makers, and artisans. The first step of the research methodology was to do a site analysis and mapping of the existing fashion ecosystem in the area. The following diagram breaks down the elements of the fiber shed system into three main categories, consisting of fashion production, community networks, and end-of-life phases. In order to build off this research, I've mapped the end-of-life phases, such as repair and care, which consists of dry cleaners and tailors, resale and reuse, which consists of charity shops and vintage stores, and recycling centers and textile recycling banks. These recycling centers act as collection points and sorting facilities, but are not capable to recycle materials on site. This is where the Fiber Lab project steps in to close the gap in local infrastructure by setting up an educational material testing and recycling studio. The studio is funded by a grant from Procter & Gamble's Better Lives Award and is located in the local fashion hub at Artbyte Studios. This space was granted from the local council as a trial for the next 8 weeks. Prior to setting up the studio, interviews were done with the resident designers at Artbyte, as well as the wider fashion business community in order to identify their waste streams and co-develop circular solutions. Textile and plastic waste are among the most concerning and prevalent in the local industry and can be separated into 3 main processes. The technological cycle consists of plastic waste and synthetic fibers, which can then be melted down and used as a raw material source. The biological cycle includes cellulose fibers and food waste that can then be composted locally or recycled into new materials. And lastly, blended textiles, which require new technologies such as chemical recycling to separate the fibers and feed them back into their separate cycles. Waste samples were then collected from participating designers and sorted by fabric quality and then by color. A sample of cotton fabric was then put through the custom-built small-scale shredding machine to achieve the medium-sized pieces. After attaching a 6mm mesh to the shredder and putting the sample through again, a much finer, pulp-like fiber was achieved. This final sample is comparable to industrial-scale quality. The cellulose pulp can then be combined with a bioplastic or bioresin to create a firm, long-lasting material that could be used in a variety of applications, from furniture to fashion artifacts and accessories. Alternatively, the material can be combined with regenerative cellulose to be spun into new fiber, or simply can be composted to fuel local food, fiber, or dye cultivation. A similar process of shredding, melting, and molding will be followed with plastics and synthetic fibers to create a filament that can be used to 3D print fashion artifacts. My last challenge remains in small-scale chemical recycling, as this knowledge is currently protected by patents and is less easily accessible. Overall, this research acts as a proof of concept that communities can implement circular solutions by intercepting local waste streams and using them as valuable material resources. The knowledge generated and machinery used will be open-sourced and documented in a FiberLab framework that can easily be replicated in other cities all around the world. This low-budget setup also offers developing nations a solution to dealing with the mass amounts of waste that have been sent there. In conclusion, the project builds off the FiberShed system that uses regionalized supply chains and local resources. In the urban context, this is waste, not wool.
Brilliant. Can I invite Kate to come onto the screen?
Hi.
Hi, Kayla. That was brilliant, and we've had lots of really positive feedback to your presentation in the chat already. I think one of the things that really struck me was that you were really sort of intercepting the process that normally would happen around waste. I mean, in terms of proof of concept, do you think this is something that could be adopted anywhere? I mean, even in the global south?
Yes, that's one of the main things that I'm trying to work on, is to make this information open source, and also a low budget setup so that it can work in the global south and other communities that might not have access to a lot of funding to create their own recycling and circular economies. So coming up with solutions where there's a lot of waste, but there's not a lot of infrastructure, so communities can really take it upon themselves to make a difference.
And you refer to it as infrastructure, but is it in fact about building local capabilities to be able to take control of something that would otherwise be a problem?
Yes, it's turning that waste that would usually harm communities into a resource that can be used to really help their economies thrive.
Brilliant. And one of the things that I'm quite interested in is after your proof of concept sort of finished, what happened afterwards? Were people motivated to still continue operating in that way?
Well, I hope so. It's not quite finished yet, so I mean, there's been a lot of interest from the local community, so I hope it can continue on after the MA and hopefully grow and develop further. So.
Brilliant. But one of the things that I think struck me was that the project itself was funded by Procter & Gamble. Do you think there's a tension there between sort of higher up? I mean, I don't want to think of it as in a linear sense, but sort of on the different part of the supply chain, perhaps where this waste is being created. Has there been a sort of communication channel back to say, actually, this is what we've learned, and there were learning points for them too?
Yeah, well, it's a collaboration with UAL as well. They offer a grant every year to UAL students. So obviously, there's that kind of wanting to give back and have this social responsibility from a corporate point of view, but not, taking all of these ideas and putting them into place within their corporate setting is obviously a problem. But I have been in contact with one of the sponsors from Procter & Gamble, and he's really interested in the project and presenting it to wider Procter & Gamble network. So I'm hopefully going to have a presentation to their wider network soon to spread these ideas up the ladder as well.
Brilliant. And one of the things that I was just interested in was, do you get a different eye view of what is sort of circulating through the particular area through this process of managing waste? Do you kind of see what people are consuming? Do you see it in a different sense?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is I kind of went into the project thinking about what waste streams I was going to find, and then after talking with the community members and local designers and people in the area, I kind of start to realize, oh, what I thought was the problem isn't actually the problem. So I think that was really interesting, especially thinking about textile waste and seeing what materials the designers are using, how there's really such interest in cotton and natural fibers in that area as well, and such a big denim manufacturing in the area. So I think, yeah, that's been kind of interesting.
And just you said something about what you thought was the problem wasn't, or that was challenged. Could you just unpack that slightly?
Yeah, so I went into the project really wanting to work with food waste, for example, because it's just something that, I mean, I'm passionate about food, as I'm sure a lot of us are. But after talking with a lot of the local designers, I realized that there are kind of already solutions in place to food waste, and people are really struggling with what to do with their fabric and plastic waste. So I decided to kind of switch gears a little bit and focus really just on the fabric and plastic waste.
And that process, I mean, that's quite interesting that you kind of responded to local need. Is that part of this as a concept, is rather than sort of wholesale importing, this is what waste management looks like, that it becomes a conversation with the community to actually say, well, what does that look like within this area? And how can we develop solutions that fit that local populace?
Yeah, well, my research is all about like participatory action research. So going into a community and seeing, what are their problems that they're facing and how can we come up with solutions together to kind of address those challenges. And it will be different in all different communities. Obviously different parts of the world will be impacted by different types of waste. So it's all about taking a really unique approach.
Brilliant. And I noticed that you were saying that I think you were from the US originally. What do you think some of the differences might be trying to implement this type of project in that environment compared to the East End of London?
I'm really glad you asked that, because when I was working in the industry in New York, no one considers sustainability. It's all about the bottom line. And it's kind of just an afterthought, and it's used as a tool for greenwashing and increasing marketing, and some of the things that I saw happening behind the scenes were just really terrible. So when I came here and saw how people are so genuinely interested in sustainability and how there's such a culture around it, and the government's involved in it, and people just of all different ethnicities are so interested and really have such a deep knowledge and understanding, it makes it a lot easier to kind of implement these pilot projects in London and have it be able to really thrive here.
Brilliant. Well, we've had some sort of questions coming through. I think people have talked about different collaborations and different areas that you might be able to use this sort of approach. Have you thought about different types of waste? I mean, you said you've moved from food waste to sort of clothing waste and plastic waste. Have you thought about how it might be extended to different areas?
Yeah, well, I was hoping in the final project to kind of have a framework of like the main waste outputs around the world. You know, there's just a few key categories and solutions that you can use to address those material waste streams, and kind of putting that in a framework that people can go, okay, well, actually, you know, this type of construction waste is really prevalent in my community. What can I do with this material? So yeah, that's something I'm hoping to put into more of a theoretical framework at the end.
Brilliant. And again, you talked about making this open source. Is that really the aspiration for all of this, that part of democratizing the process and being able to, you talked about intercepting, is allowing people to take control more?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem in the industry as well. People are always trying to like safeguard their knowledge, and I think we're not going to get very far in the time that we need to make such a big change if we're kind of hoarding our knowledge and not sharing it and not kind of democratizing it around the world. So I think open source is, you know, it's a thing where people are hesitant to do, but I think that is the key thing. We need to really democratize our information and say, okay, these are the tools, this is how you build the machine, this is how you collect the waste, this is how you process it step by step, in order to allow people to really be able to take control and make change in their community.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a question through from, I think, Sani. Can we bring Sani online?
I don't know if anyone can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, nice to meet you. I really love your project.
Thank
And
you.
especially how you involve the community, which I'm really interested in myself as well. And I just wonder, because especially as designers and artists, we like the idea of bringing the community in, but I can also imagine how that can be a barrier to speak to the community. So I'm kind of wondering, who do you think that are key partners that have to be involved to make that happen? So do you think that the council, for example, has to play a big role in this, or do you kind of expect that to come from the community itself?
Well, I don't know if I clarified this, but I've been specifically working with the business community. So people who are designers, people who have small businesses in the area, and kind of working with them first, because for me, those are where, you know, the biggest waste streams happen. You know, they happen in the processing of making stuff, and they happen at the business level. And then we always put so much pressure on the consumer or the typical community member to take it upon themselves to recycle or learn how to do these processes. But really, I think it has to come from the businesses and, like you said, the local council. I have been talking a little bit with the local council, and they've been really helpful and supportive as well. So that is definitely an element that you have to consider. But yeah, I think really identifying your community is important, and just narrowing in on who you want to work with.
Yeah, but you don't feel like you need to be kind of reliant on council support, or you feel like the sort of strength of the community itself really comes together and makes it happen. That's interesting.
Yeah, the local community here is really, really supportive of everything, and they have such a dedication to sustainability already. So I think it makes it actually quite easy because they're really sincerely interested in learning new things and improving how to be sustainable. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder how that could reflect in maybe other communities that might not have that same drive or same forward thinking. I wonder how that could be then applied in other communities that might not have that kind of thinking behind it. But yeah, interesting.
Well, it's also about, I think, educating, community members as well, inviting them in with something, you have a problem, what are your problems? Tell me about your problems, and then maybe I can help you come up with a solution. So I think people are always looking for help. It's just about how you go about addressing it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for brilliant questions. And thank you again, Kayla, for a great presentation, and to all of our presenters today. I know that we've got to sort of wrap up in terms of time, but I want to thank everybody for giving us literally, in some instances, food for thought, thinking about things in new and different ways. And I think it's very easy to kind of find gaps or holes or reasons why things wouldn't work. But I think what's so exciting about all of the presentations that we've heard is that it's opening us up to think about these things in new and different ways. And within each of those challenges, there becomes a new project, a new idea about how we can do things better than how we're doing things at the moment. So thank you, Kayla. Thank you, everybody, for your presentations. And thank you, everyone, also for your chat and for your questions as well. And thank you for inviting me, because this has been brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to now welcome Loula onto our digital stage. So yeah, I'm really happy to welcome Loula for the second part of our Circular Ideas session. So Loula is a PhD researcher in sustainable biomaterials, and actually, Loula, you're a CSM student, but you also have a supervisor at the Centre for Circular Design, who is Kate Goldsworthy. And I think, I'm just really excited because I've been having conversations with you about your work and about all the different challenges and the complexity of the field in biomaterials for circularity. And I've heard you talk about your field trips working with farmers in Colombia, and I'm just really interested to hear a bit more about your research here. And I'll leave the floor to you for your presentations, and then we'll have a session of Q&A leading us up to our first break. So there you go, Loula. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the team at TABA for making this happening. I have to say, all of the presentations from the MA students as well were fantastic. Congratulations, very inspiring. And I will be, there was a couple of presentations who were very much connected to what I'm going to talk today. I will take my camera off during the presentation, and then I will come back after. This is just to make it easier for me to go through the slides. And so yes, I have a background in fashion and textile design with a focus in sustainability. And I'm just trying to access my file. Yeah. But really, these days, I consider myself more sort of, it's a bit difficult to explain, but a holistic system designer who explores biomaterials from plant waste. And I hope that through my talk, I will be able to bring some light into what that even means. I'm also the founder of the Collective Immaculate. I founded this in 2005, yes. And with Immaculate, I've been working with a group of designers to contribute with sustainable solutions. And what we're looking is to explore connections with the environment, communities, and industry. And we do that also through looking at traditions and how to connect those with innovation technologies. So my current practice at Central St. Martin's studies how principles from regenerative agriculture, and more specifically permaculture, could inform regenerative design methods for circularity. And it really focuses on the holistic and symbiotic principles highlighted by permaculture. I don't know if many of you know about it. I'm not going to talk long about permaculture today, but I'm going to tell you that I'm looking at those principles from permaculture that explore the concept of waste as resource. So that's one of my key elements of my research. And so I do this by examining the agro-industry of coffee in Colombia, and I'm looking for the residual outputs from the industrial processing. And as you probably know, there's a lot of coffee being produced in Colombia, and a lot of it gets processed in Colombia. Some of it just goes abroad. But I'm looking for these outputs to use as resource for new materials, to make new materials from that. So in today's talks, I would like to present you a brief hypnosis of my current or more recent experience doing primary research in the farms of Colombia. I was there at the beginning of this year, in January. And then I will share some thoughts on my current research with biomaterial making and holistic design, which I hope will make you curious and maybe perhaps even to spark some questions from the talk. So my main research question for my PhD has been changing during these past 3 years. I'm on my 3rd year part-time, by the way. And this is a very common thing in most PhD research studies. So my first question, my first departure began with, are circular design models sustainable to develop new fibers from agro-industrial byproducts of coffee and cacao in Colombia? So this is a really long question, but also it's quite a broad field of inquiry. And it took me almost a whole 1st year to move into my second question, which became, or rather my new question, which became how circular design systems could develop new sustainable textile fibers from agro-industrial waste of coffee in Colombia. So by then, what happened is I had sufficient data that made me focus only on one crop instead of 2. So I moved from cacao, which is chocolate basically, from cacao and coffee to look only into coffee. But I also moved from circular design models to circular design systems. So I really became more interested in the systems. And eventually, through my 2nd year of research, which I had the opportunity to do quite a few field trips and interviews, and then that really got me to my current question, which is how principles from permaculture could inform regenerative design methods for circularity. And that has subtitle, which is examining the outputs from the agro-industry of coffee in Colombia to develop new biomaterials. And as you can see, I have included the term permaculture and biomaterials in the in question, which were concepts that were with me from the beginning of my research, but I didn't really kind of knew how to, I was just discovering them and I didn't have clarity about what that even really meant. But also from the beginning of my research, I have been focusing on the biological cycles of circular design. And these are as defined by circular economy models, where materials and energy from discarded products or byproducts are reintroduced into the economic system. And concurrently, I was looking at permaculture as a system that could inform how to preserve and recover value. So I was really looking for how to preserve and recover value from industrial agriculture waste, because value was from the beginning a very important issue for me. And it was really through looking at the permaculture lens that I began to dig deeper into regenerative agriculture. And regenerative agriculture was not new to me because I had the experience of working with organic cotton farmers and bamboo growers and other type of agricultural processes, but I didn't knew that much about regenerative agriculture and how extensive it is, but also how important it is for all of us. So when I began to sort of examine the permacultural principles against the circular economy principles, it became more evident to me that to build a healthier relationship to natural systems, we have to look beyond closing loops. And I will explain why. And we have to look just beyond closing a loop. And perhaps we need to prioritize how to establish a regenerative approach that directs us to well. And so I traveled to some farms in the center and north of Colombia with the objective of gathering data about coffee outputs and its industry. And by the way, I'm from Colombia. I didn't mention that before, but it could be obvious because of my accent, I hope. And so Colombia, for those of you who don't know, is a country in South America, and it produces around 100% Arabica coffee, and is the third largest producer of coffee worldwide after Brazil and Vietnam. So it's quite an essential and powerful driving force for the country's economy, as you can imagine it. But it's also been linked to social stability and peace. And in Colombia, 95% of coffee farms are owned by small families. These are farms of about 1.3 hectares, so they're very small farms, and they are owned by family members. So there is around 563,000 families that have been usually, most of them rather, organized through an organization called National Federation of Coffee, or Federación Nacional de Cafeteros. And the remaining of the farms that produce coffee are kind of like medium-sized, and just a few big farms that are owned privately, and a few are also owned by the Federación de Cafeteros. So for my field research, I've organized visits to 6 small farms, 2 medium ones and 1 big one, to conduct interviews and collect data. And this is what I want to share with you today as well. Every time that I arrive to a farm of any size, a farmer will receive me with a very special cup of coffee. And you can imagine how special that was, made from fresh beans, roasted locally and grounded at the farm, and just made just there for me. Now, I cannot drink coffee, and some of my colleagues here know, and you can imagine how embarrassing it was for me to sort of explain to each farmer why I couldn't drink the whole cup of coffee. I did sip a little bit and then continue drinking water. What's interesting for me is that although I had experience being offered coffee at a farm before, this is a common practice in Colombia. What was interesting for me was that the farmers knew that I wasn't coming as a tourist, or even someone they knew. I came as a researcher to study the crops. But even before I began to explain my projects to the farmers or ask them any questions, their priorities seemed to me to be to connect me with the land through their personal family stories, while drinking the coffee. So they began to talk to me about the grandparents, the parents, the children, the grandchildren, and in every farm was the same. It was a story of a family. And I could say that this initial storytelling, if you want to say, made me feel somehow integrated to their coffee system. Their environment, the land, the culture, the people. I wouldn't say the families, but I certainly felt, much closer to their own experience. And so by the time by the time I sort of finished this drinking ritual, I had more answers and more information that I had prepared to ask for my research. And I could say that I have literally been given a taste of their inner relationship between the elements forming that coffee system. And this really got me thinking. And I was wondering if I could observe, if this value of the material outputs of the crop, the waste, I don't like calling them waste, so I always call them outputs. If this value of the outputs from the crops have the same direct link to its location and the people as the coffee plants themselves. And if that taking that value away by just making them into another different product, would I create a similar impact of those resultants from the industry of coffee itself? So there are quite a few sustainable issues in the coffee industry, which I'm not going to talk again about it because that is a whole talk in itself. But it really made me question whether it is truly economically circular to aim at create new value from industrial outputs only by reutilizing them and making them into new products, or whether circularity needs to center mainly on regenerative approaches that can introduce waste value, the value of the waste, back into the soil, the land, and the communities that inhabit them. Where this coffee is, where this coffee comes from, and where is it, its roots, if you want to call it. So I would like to, Kyla already mentioned it, but I'd like to share with you, probably some of you already know of Fibershade. And I really, really liked, and I'm in tune with their textile economy strategy. And I think that this is something I'll suggest you to have a look at it, because it's really beautiful, that phrase of soil to soil textile processes. It really goes to me to a kind of deep level. So in the next 4 minutes, I'll really briefly will give you a snapshot of one of my documents for the PhD, which is the Biomaterial Designers Review. And this is a project, a kind of paper that is still in process. So it's really a snap of what I have been working with. I've interviewed, or rather examined around 52 biomaterial designers to analyze 4 main constructs of their biomaterial making. So I'm looking at the kind of core sustainability concerns and how they work with different design approaches, their making processes, the origin of their biomaterial source, but also the market expectations. And for my research, I selected designers from completely different backgrounds during a period up to about May 2020. I was looking for biomaterial makers who were sourcing their basic biomaterials from plant-based and non-animal byproducts. So I'm not interested in people working with animal byproducts. I'm also interested in biomaterials with crops which are resulting from waste or outputs from agriculture, and not those ones which have been grown specifically for biomaterial development, and also occurring at processing or after consumption. And so this selection really also established designers who have been creating biomaterials that have moved from that experimental or laboratory phase, and that were testing their biomaterials to make objects. So I'm interested in the process from agricultural outputs to products, and not just from outputs to lab. And so I've conducted secondary and primary research, I did a lot of sort of trying to find information for my secondary research from all sort of different ways, from the designers' websites, blogs, and interviews and references from all the sort of key industry members. And what was interesting was that during secondary research, I found that 49% of designers and brands connected the biomaterial with circular economy and circular design. Some of them even stating that the biomaterial would contribute to a circular economy. But when I conducted the primary research through direct interviews with the designers, and I have to explain again that I'm still need to interview a few more of them, I began to find discrepancies from the secondary data that I found. And what I found was that I've done this sort of document that I gave to the designers previous the interview, and this was just to allow them to interpret my terminology. So when I asked the same questions and similar questions, what was interesting for me was that this time the percentage of designers connecting their biomaterial with circular economy changed from 49% to 100%. They all consider their approach to be circular, with the potential to contribute towards circular economy. So that was really interesting for me. And I wonder, again, how this terminology needs to be clarified. So finally, I'd really like to briefly tell you about holistic design approach, or HDA, sorry. Holistic scientific approach to research emphasizes the study of complex systems and implies the idea that the properties of a given system cannot be determined or even fully explained by its components alone. And so concurrently, the design approach sees again that similar interconnection, and ultimately looks at designs as a part of a, everything, of a whole world. So during my study with permaculture, I found a definition that really tuned with me. And that is that permaculture is the holistic method to design systems based on reproducing the fundamental links that nature uses to sustain life. And that's from the Fundación Runa Kawasi, which is a non-profit organization in Peru. But this statement really compiled many aspects that have been core to my practice and my research and my personal life, I think. And more specifically, the appreciation of a holistic method that centers on how nature understands systems and how is this being fundamental to sustain life. So often the term regenerative design methods implies processes that look at conservation or restoration, rehabilitation, and all of that. So I'm really looking at the links that connect these systems, and I have a few questions, but I'm gonna skip on that one now. So finally, I would like to give you with the words of someone who's inspired me enormously, and that is Masanobu Fukuoka, and probably some of you know him as well. He is one of the luminaries of the permaculture philosophy, but also created the Do Nothing agriculture movement. And he says that the healing of the land and the purification of the human spirit is the same process. And I really find that deep in many levels again, and I find it beautiful, but also very present in our current moment and time. So I hope that that leaves you with some ideas of what I'm doing on my journey with permaculture. And thank you so much. I'm going to put the camera back again, and hopefully I'll be able to see some of you and reply to questions that I hope you have. And if we don't have time for that, I'm quite happy to also receive questions by email.
Thank you, Loula. That was really, really great. And it's just always like a huge pleasure to actually hear about your work, because I feel like there's so much, like, it's funny because it's like there's a lot of depth to it, like in the way that you're like really sort of like questioning the ways of thinking around the circular economy and, like, this specific resource and the connection to the land. But there's also like so much like the broad connections also that come through like all these different perspectives, and your approach as sort of a university researcher as well as being sort of like really connected to the people that you've been working with. So I have a question here from Kate in the chat, which I think I'm going to build on a little bit, because Kate is sort of realizing and sort of like bringing to the front the fact that there's a tricky question that's often asked by the science community around how biodegradation is it really a circular thing, because it comes out of the ground and then it goes back. Apologies, my camera's off because my connection isn't great, but I am here, I can see you.
Yes.
And so you have like that scientific approach, just like what is biodegradation? Does it work in a circular system? Then I know that you've been looking at it from a very design perspective, and your background is in fashion design and textiles. So like I think that also gives you like quite a like specific perspective on this. And then on the other hand, you've also been sort of like looking at sort of endemic knowledge and sort of like the circularity that exists already within farming communities that hasn't necessarily been coined in the circular economies debate. So like it's quite a complex question, but I was wondering how you were connecting all these different approaches to circularity.
Right. Well, I'm in process. So what is happening, I feel, is that it's really an experiential almost situation. So it's almost like it develops as I experience more and more of this, find these connections happening. In regards to the biodegradability, because this is a very important subject and one that should always be also kind of on the table. The fact that in a way even the most natural and purest materials biodegrade, and they end up in systems where perhaps shouldn't be or will alter those systems. So biodegradability, it's something that it should also be a priority in terms of bio material making and any other material making. How that connects with the systems where that material become part of. So if you take a material from Colombia or from India and place it in London, it comes with a whole components of organisms, like Kate was perhaps saying, and those will go and run through the water system, through the earth systems, and that's something that in a way we cannot completely control, in the sense of we will have to then not move anything from its location, but that we could understand better and see what is this, let's say, this kind of dance, how do they connect, what is happening when cotton arrives to England, when silk arrives to Colombia. So with the biomaterial making, it's exactly the same. It's sometimes even more complicated, and it raises even larger questions, because we're talking about other products that we have not used before. In my case, coffee, you know, and other things that I will use to make the material. So it is a very important question, and quite a large answer that I don't will pretend to answer today, but I think that it's definitely something that we need to have a look at and take very seriously. Yes, how to connect. I feel that connection, we're really kind of doing it right now, connecting through digital experience, but we all have different senses of what being connected means. And I think for me, being connected also implies the knowledge of, in a way, awareness. And that is a big subject to even talk about it, but it is about having, even beginning to have the awareness of these systems and making them visible, making them accessible. And something that Kyla said before when she mentions intersecting local waste streams, local output streams, that's very important to understand where these outputs are occurring and what they mean. That is a big work that we will have to do for, for many years. And the most important is not to continue producing waste without understanding what it does and what it is and where it comes from.
Yeah, I think like there's so much sort of like wealth of like different themes that come together in your work. It's really interesting to see that. Like, and I think like the designer perspective and the way you've been interviewing designers and like really sort of like crossing over all these different expectations for biomaterials is really interesting. And obviously it's like a big part of the work that we're sort of like now starting on the Hereware project also, where we're trying to understand how we can like really develop these circular biomaterials, and the local aspect is really important also. And I think you really brilliantly touched on all those themes in your presentation in this like quick Q&A session. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the end of our time here, but it's been really great having you on, and sort of like you said, we can really keep these conversations going beyond the event, and this is really what this event is about also, is sort of like flagging all this amazing expertise that we have like at the university and in our different networks, and really hopefully making connections. So yeah,